Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about another common misconception that people have about Atlantis. And this misconception is that Atlantis had to have been an island as we define it. Now, what do I mean by an island as we define it, an island as we know it? When we think of an island, we think of something like this, a body of land that's surrounded by water on all of its sides. For example, you can't just you have to take a boat to reach that island. It's surrounded by water. And this is a common example of an island. And another example of an island is the Hawaiian Islands. Clearly it's completely surrounded by water. You need to take an airplane or a boat to get there, and you can't just walk from a continent to an island. And this is an example of another island that's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, St. Helena. If you're aware of the historical reference, this is where Napoleon was imprisoned after he was defeated in his second attempt to retake the French throne. And so clearly Napoleon is here because he can't he's obviously surrounded by water, and that's what makes this an ideal prison for someone who's obviously very good at escaping and rising to power. And so this seems almost so obvious that it seems unnecessary to say it, right? An island is an island, and everybody knows what an island is. And so Plato actually himself says that Atlantis is an island over and over again. This island was larger than Libya and Asia put together, as is said in the Timaeus, was the way to other islands. And now, in this island of Atlantis, this makes it clear that he's not just talking about islands in general and Atlantis in general, but he's actually specifically saying that Atlantis was an island. And so on, that the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea. This was caused by the subsidence of the island. So Atlantis is an island. Enough said, this presentation should be over right now. The problem is, Atlantis was not originally written by Englishmen or Americans or an English-speaking people. It was originally written down in the Greek language and was said to have come from an Egyptian story. So there are bound to be some errors in translation in the narrative. The question is, which errors in translation are actually significant and which are just artificial errors that have been created by people with an agenda to push their particular viewpoint. In order to distinguish between the two, it's probably best to actually consult the ideas of an expert. And this is what writer Mark Adams, who wrote the book Meet Me in Atlantis, did when he spoke to a professor named Dr. Stavros Papamarinopoulos. And he's a geophysicist at the University of Patras in Greece. And he, among other things, in an interview that was published on Slate.com, he mentioned that the word island has been actually translated from the Greek word nesos, spelled Nesos, and that nesos, both in ancient Greece and in modern Greek, both in the ancient and the modern variants of the Greek language, doesn't have one specific meaning as island does in English, where it specifically means about a land that's surrounded by water on all sides that's not large enough to be a continent. On the other hand, Nessos actually has multiple meanings. And Papamarinopoulos argued and emphasized that people have just taken Atlantis as a giant island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that this giant island in the Atlantic Ocean, that this is one possible interpretation. I'm not saying that interpretation is absolutely false, but I'm saying there are alternatives, and those alternatives aren't being considered. And this is exactly what Professor Papamarinopoulos is also emphasizing. This professor emphasizes that Nessos is a word with multiple meanings, as I've said before, and that he is actually a Greek professor. He knows Greek, he reads and writes in ancient Greek, so I think we can really trust what he says as reliable knowledge. In the 6th century BC, when the Atlantis story was supposedly heard for the first time, Nessos had 5 geographical meanings. One of those meanings is an island as we know it. 2, 3, 4, and 5 are completely different from the word island as we know it today. They have nothing to do with an island. If somebody described an island as being one of these landforms, they would be really, we would look at them funny because it's just not what we mean when we say the word island. But at the time the Greeks wrote the story, this word had multiple meanings, and if we just exclude those possibilities from the outset, then we're potentially gaining an inaccurate understanding of what Atlantis actually could have been, because Atlantis was described as being a nesos in the original text that was written by Plato. And so we have to actually look at what Plato could have meant. And so by this definition, our conception of Atlantis as just being this island that's surrounded by water on all four sides, regardless of where it is, like this is not a question of where Atlantis is. This is a question of what Atlantis is. And so anybody who just blindly suggests that Atlantis is an island, for example, Santorini in the Mediterranean, or the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean, or the many numerous theories such as Malta or any of these theories that place Atlantis in the middle of some ocean or sea surrounded by water. And again, I'm not saying that those ideas are necessarily wrong, like 100% wrong. I'm saying, hey, there's alternatives. And the ideas that are presenting Atlantis and placing it in a continent, for example, the idea of Jim Allen when he places Atlantis in the Altiplano in Bolivia, it's a land within a continent surrounded by lakes, rivers, or springs. We can ask to what extent that actually Jim Allen's Atlantis location actually qualifies to this definition to whatever degree. But just because it's a land within a continent doesn't mean that it's necessarily excluded according to this definition, which allows that possibility to actually be the case. The Bolivian Altiplano is a land within the South American continent. And so, what does this mean? What are the implications of this possible multiple interpretations? Interpretations that have actually been given the stamp of approval by an actual Greek professor who reads and understands the ancient Greek language. It means that Atlantis isn't necessarily an island as we define it, which is a land that's surrounded by water on all sides. It doesn't mean it's not. It just means it isn't necessarily that. If we are to conclude that it is a land surrounded by water on all sides as a traditional meaning of an island, then we need additional textual evidence to support it. But the fact is that textual evidence is not really so much in favor of that idea, that Atlantis is just this island as we know it, because Atlantis is so large that it's unlikely to be an island as we know it, because most islands that we are familiar with are very small. And there's exceptions such as Greenland, the Indonesian islands, for example, New Guinea, Madagascar. Those islands were described as even larger than the island of Atlantis as described by Plato, or around the same size. But those islands are rare. And it's rare that we have an example of an island just sinking, an island just actually just disappearing of that size. So that's already questioning the idea that Atlantis is just a typical island. And also, it's just too rich in natural resources and wildlife for a typical island. Again, there are exceptions, kind of like Borneo, the Indonesian islands, New Guinea, which are also very rich. But it's like those islands just don't have enough. Typical islands don't have enough resources to support this range of wildlife that was present in Atlantis. And if Atlantis were indeed an island as we know it, it would perhaps be the most extraordinary one that we ever knew of. And the likelihood that Atlantis was this incredible island that's nothing like other islands really that we are familiar with today is just unlikely. I think the fifth possible translation of nesos, which was shown in the previous slide and is shown here again, a land within a continent surrounded by lakes, rivers, or springs. But the key phrase here is a land within a continent. That is, Atlantis may not have just been an island as we know it, but it could possibly have been a part of a larger continent, connected and continuous and contiguous with that continent. And this idea is not just something that I'm putting forth to push my personal agenda. It's an idea that's actually backed up by an authority in the field, namely Professor Papamarinopoulos, who actually understands and reads and writes the ancient Greek language in which Atlantis is written, and therefore that translation of the word nesos as into this English translation, instead of as an island just surrounded by water, as we know it, is actually founded and is actually something that is a valid interpretation. And in future videos, I am going to elaborate on this concept of a land within a continent.